Hi, happy Women's History Month. It's Deb Harkness, the author of A Discovery of Witches and the rest of the All Souls series, including the Blackbird Oracle, the fifth book in the series that's coming out this summer on July 16th, 2024. In honor of Women's History Month, I wanted to pop on and put on my professorial mortarboard and give you my take on four famous women from the past who I think still have interesting things to say to us today. So I've written my notes down on a napkin, pro tip, and I wanted to start with, of course, Queen Elizabeth I, one of the most important and influential women in Western European history. Not world history, but definitely Western European history. And that's my area of expertise, so that's what we're going to stick to today. But I wanted to tell you 5 things the history books may not tell you about Elizabeth I. The first one is Elizabeth I would have made a great classics professor. That's right, classics professor. Her favorite thing to do was something called double translation. She did it every day. She took a text in Latin and then she would translate it into Greek and then she would put it away for a week or two and then she'd pull it back out and she'd translate it back from Greek into Latin. She also did this with Greek and English. She did it with Latin and English. She did it with all kinds of different languages. So for those of you who are trying to explain to anyone, why you're a classics student, whether it's in secondary school or college or university, you can always just tell them it didn't do Elizabeth I any harm, and it's not going to do me any harm either. She was famous for being able to dispute and, let's face it, get a bit stroppy in Latin with foreign ambassadors and would just rail at them in Latin for, 35, 40 minutes, an hour. So she was fluent in these languages and she just loved them. She loved that aspect of her intellectual life. The second thing is related to the first, which is that when we think of Elizabeth, we think of her as a political being. We think of her as someone who was always wanting to speak to political issues of the time, who was the strong leader. All of that is true. However, she also was someone who was chronically late to state council meetings. So these daily meetings that would take place or regular meetings that would take place tended to happen quite early in the morning at around 9 a.m., typical work hours. And Elizabeth was often late to them because she really liked to spend her mornings as much as possible in her night clothes with her books, doing her double translations, reading, journaling. So she was not someone whose number one priority every morning was, got to get up and get to the state papers and the state documents and see William Cecil. No, she really wanted to hang out with Cicero or some other, dead poet or dead philosopher. The third thing the history books may not tell you about Elizabeth I is that she really hated making decisions. She had learned over her life the value of delay and prevarication and having another think about things and saying, well, maybe she would, but then again, maybe she wouldn't. So she was one of those interesting leaders that was not particularly well known for her decisiveness, and yet perhaps it was her ability to go with the flow, to take different inputs, to wait until the wind shifted a little bit to make a decision, was really kind of key to her survival, as opposed to being, we're going to make war with France. I'm going to invade Scotland. One of the places she was most indecisive and made this into kind of the running theme of her entire reign was around her marriage, right? So she kept saying, oh, well, maybe I'll marry Ivan the Terrible. Maybe I'll marry Eric of Sweden. Maybe I'll marry someone who's English. Well, I don't know. Maybe I'll consider this person over here. And the more she entertained suitors and the more she sort of didn't make a decision, but maybe she'll make a decision tomorrow, the more suitors came and the more she was able to survive from one day to the next with this very, very unusual profile of being an unmarried female monarch. The fourth thing that the history books may not tell you is that Elizabeth I slept almost every night of her life with another woman in her bed. Most people did not sleep alone in the 16th century. You needed to sleep with other people because beds were expensive. Even for a royal, beds were cold. No matter how much firewood you use, these are drafty old stone buildings. And I loved to know that Elizabeth liked to climb into bed with one of her closest friends, and they would lay in bed and gossip and probably dissect everything that had happened that day and who was wearing what and who was having an affair with whom, etc. People always want to know, was Elizabeth really a virgin? And I think she was far too prudent to take the irreversible step of having sexual relations with a man who might impregnate her and who would certainly have something very significant to hold over her. And people always say, well, wasn't she lonely? Well, no, she got to have a sleepover every night with all of her friends. And that includes the ladies of the bedchamber. But usually there was one specific person who she preferred at a given moment in her life. One of them's names was Dorothy Broadbelt, someone who might have been illegitimate daughter with a laundress of Henry VIII named Ursula, was another of her bedfellows. So don't worry too much about Elizabeth. She had good gossips to hang out with. And the other thing that I want to say that the history books often don't talk about is that, sadly, for someone who was so well educated, for someone who knew the benefits of a fine education, for someone who knew how hard it was to be a woman and survive in a man's world, which it certainly was in the 16th century, Elizabeth did virtually nothing directly to improve or change the status of women. Unlike many queens who were married to kings and were occupied the role like Queen Camilla does of queen consort, those women often would set up schools or they would set up needlework workshops. They would do something specific in aid of women and women's learning, women's charities. Elizabeth did not do that. One of the reasons that historians cite for this is that she was too busy protecting her position as an honorary male, is what the historians call it. So she almost wanted to be more publicly associated with her male courtiers. She liked going to Oxford. She liked going to Cambridge. Women weren't admitted there. So it's one of those interesting little things about Elizabeth that she is one of our great female predecessors and role models, and yet she did not do very much to lift the condition of other women directly. However, indirectly, she was the olive that couldn't be put back in the bottle, the genie who couldn't be put back in the bottle. Once Elizabeth I came to the throne and held on to it for nearly half a century, no one could ever say again that a woman could not rule on her own. And that lasting legacy is why I want to celebrate her for Women's History Month. I celebrate her all the time. And for those of you who know Shadow of Night, the second book in the All Souls series, you know that Elizabeth was known to both Diana Bishop and Matthew Claremont. So with that, enjoy tomorrow. It's Women's History Day, but we're celebrating women's history the whole month of March. So go out there, talk to some of your elders, make sure you tell those stories to your younger folk in your life. And I'll be back next week with another 5 things the history books don't tell you about some important woman from the past. Take care. Bye.